For years, the official Five Nights at Freddy's books have been the source of one of the fiercest debates in the entire FNAF community. Are the books canon? This simple question has caused countless flame wars in Discord servers, fan forums, and game theory comment sections for nearly a decade. But today, I think I finally have the answer. That could completely change how we choose to interpret the events of the Silver Eyes trilogy, Fazbear Frights, and Tales from the Pizzaplex. Not only that, but this theory even has some implications towards the canonicity of the fan games. Weird, right? So get ready to dive into the pit of theorizing, because I piggy promise this video will make you question everything. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of this one, I'm just gonna come out and say it. No, the books do not depict first-hand accounts of canon events. You'll notice my phrasing of that was incredibly specific, and there is a reason for that. But first, we need a little background on why it's been so hard to figure out what is and isn't canon in the first place. It may be hard to remember since it was 10 years ago, but this franchise started with 4 games before we got a book. 4 whole games, each packed with tiny details and hidden lore that painted a bigger picture. During that first year of Five Nights at Freddy's, we theorized about whether or not Phone Guy was Purple Guy, if Crying Child was Golden Freddy, and what order the games were even supposed to be in, all without having a single real named character or having any indication of what Purple Guy's motive was to kill those kids. But that all changed with the release of The Silver Eyes on December 17th, 2015, the first book in the series. All of a sudden, we were given characters like Charlotte and Henry Emily, Michael Brooks, and the child-murdering psycho who started it all, Dave? Really? That's the purple guy? What kind of a name for a serial killer is Dave? Oh, I guess it's actually William Afton. Alright, that's better, B+. Anyways, this book was packed with so many intricate details and descriptions of the world of Five Nights at Freddy's. We now knew that William Afton, the man behind the murders, was actually one of the men who built Freddy Fazbear's into the business it is. We learned about Henry Emily, his business partner who created the animatronic characters. We learned that Golden Freddy was apparently possessed by a kid named Michael Brooks. This was the motherlode of answers we had been looking for a long time. But for a lot of people, The Silver Eyes was hard to accept as canon. I mean, people had been theorizing for over a year at this point, and this sudden information dump felt incredibly disconnected and inconsistent with what had existed before. Fortunately, Scott quickly stepped in and clarified that The Silver Eyes was meant to be a separate continuity, and that the story of the games is finished. And you would think that was that. The creator said they're 2 separate stories, so the books and the games have nothing to do with each other, right? Right? Well, that was true for about a year, until...
She can dance. She can sing. She's equipped with a built-in helium tank for inflating balloons right at her fingertips. She can even dispense ice cream.
With all due respect, those aren't the design choices we were curious about, Mr. Afton.
With sister location, Scott made the name William Afton canon to the games, seemingly in complete contradiction to his previous statements about the books being a separate continuity. And this contradiction was the beginning of the book wars. Book battles? Maybe book battles sounds better. We'll go with that. So next we got the Twisted Ones, which created the idea of illusion discs, and that really didn't sit well with some people. Illusion discs made theorists reject the books even more. But then came Pizzeria Simulator, which contained a lot of parallels with the books, implying Charlotte Emily might be the puppet, and Henry Emily might be the cassette man. And all of a sudden, there's more to argue in favor of the books again. And by the time of Ultimate Custom Night in the Fourth Closet, it felt like Scott was trying to conclude the story in his games. And although theorists remained puzzled about how the books were meant to be interpreted, the overall consensus was that whether or not the books were completely canon, the events of the games are at least somewhat related to what happens in the books. Now that's how the book argument began, with the original novel trilogy. But what happened next would bring the argument of what is and isn't canon to a whole new level. Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted. This game continued the story in a completely unexpected way. According to the lore of Help Wanted, all of the original FNAF games are actual video games that exist in the world of Help Wanted, and Fazbear Entertainment secretly hired an indie game developer that looks a lot like Scott Cawthon to create the FNAF games as an elaborate cover-up for the real murders that happened at the original pizzeria, all in an attempt to discredit the claims. This is when FNAF became more meta than it's ever been before, calling into question what part of the original games are even canon anymore. I mean, if FNAF 2 is literally just a game, then do any of the secret minigames have any significance at all? If FNAF 3 and Pizzeria Simulator are just games, then is Springtrap even real? Well, fortunately, Scott gave some clarity on the canon of Help Wanted in what just might be the most informative lore drop he's given during the Steel Wool era of games. In this thread, Scott answers the question of whether or not he himself, Scott Cawthon, now exists in the canon of the FNAF universe, to which he says, "No. My name is never actually mentioned in the game. The game says that an indie developer was tarnishing the brand of Fazbear Entertainment by making video games about them. Yes, I used my own picture for this indie developer because it's an obvious parallel, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually me in universe." He then goes on to explain in more detail why exactly he chose to make the first several games exist in universe, and confirms that Help Wanted is meant to be canon. There was a very specific challenge while making Help Wanted. The challenge was this: how do you take characters that are canon, along with characters that are questionably canon, and characters from every point of the timeline, and throw them all together in one game that is canon? I wanted it to be canon, and that meant that I needed to solve the substantial puzzle of how. Now that you all know the problem, maybe you can understand my approach. That doesn't mean you have to agree that it was a good idea. Based on that last line, Scott clearly knew this decision would be controversial, and in some ways it was. I mean, to a lot of people, it might have felt like he was throwing away everything he had created up until this point. But considering how messy the beginning of the timeline is, I think I agree that this approach is the cleanest way of maintaining the same original story beats of Five Nights at Freddy's without having to be strictly beholden to the exact lore of the original games. But that doesn't necessarily mean the original games didn't happen. I mean, it wouldn't be as good of a cover-up if these games weren't specifically designed to make real events seem less plausible. So I think it's safe to assume that there was a missing kids incident, and William Afton did it. All this means for the canonicity of the games is that they aren't first-hand perspectives on what happened. They're second-hand perspectives based on rumors and publicly available information. And that distinction right there, the difference between first-hand and second-hand accounts of real events, that is what I believe is going on with the FNAF books. Especially because in the same year Help Wanted came out, Scott gave us a new piece of FNAF media to dig into the Pit, the first entry in the new Fazbear Frights book series. There are 12 Fazbear Frights books, each containing 3 short stories that take the paranormal sci-fi elements of the series to new extremes. I mean, up until this point, it was mostly just a story about haunted robots. But now we've got ball pits that send you through time, magic gummy noses that turn you into a candy person, and that time a guy was pregnant with Springtrap. Yeah, we don't like talking about that one. Moving on, these wild stories are often quickly discarded as taking place in some sort of alternate universe that has occasional parallels to the real lore. But like the cover-up games from Help Wanted, I think that these stories are actual books that exist within the universe of the games. I think the cover-up games were way more successful than expected, and created a whole new love for the scary side of Fazbear Entertainment, which the company has been more than happy to profit off of. This could be supported by the stories In the Flesh and Prankster, where it seems the new sequels to the FNAF games are being produced by game studios, instead of some random indie developer. This would also help explain why in Security Breach, several of the arcade cabinets contain references to the books, like Catch That Fetch, Plush Trap Chaser, and the Bunbarians. These aren't just fun references to the books. They were placed here intentionally to show us how Fazbear Entertainment's sneaky cover-up has evolved into a highly profitable revenue stream, where they can sell books and games inspired by the Freddy Fazbear ghost stories from decades ago. Since the Fazbear Frights books and Help Wanted were almost certainly in development around the same time, I don't think it's a stretch to imagine that they share the same super meta narrative. Now, focusing back on Security Breach's arcade machines, I noticed that most of the on-brand characters, like Glamrock Freddy and the gang, tend to be depicted as cartoon characters, whereas characters that Fazbear Entertainment might not consider to be part of the brand, like Scrap Baby and Scrap Trap, are still depicted as animatronics. The same is true for Fetch and the Plush Trap Chaser from the Fazbear Frights books, as well as Ella and Theo from the Silver Eyes trilogy. So if the theory's true, then this implies that the Silver Eyes book trilogy also exists in-universe, perhaps even being part of that original cover-up. Then there are two other characters curiously depicted as animatronics on the Security Breach arcade machines, Ignited Freddy and Ignited Bonnie. Some of you may instantly recognize these unofficial characters from the FNAF fan game series, The Joy of Creation. The Joy of Creation is one of the few fan games that's actually part of the official Fazbear Fanverse initiative, which Scott created to help fund and support specific popular FNAF fan games. Now, if we apply the same logic we've been using thus far, then it's possible that The Joy of Creation and subsequently all the games in the Fazbear Fanverse initiative all exist in the game universe as well. One of the managers who worked on FNAF's special delivery even confirmed that Scott considered Fanverse characters to be part of their character roster, and characters like Candies and Popgoes could have been added to official products. So if the real world's Fanverse initiative is meant to be analogous to the game world's Fanverse initiative, then Fazbear Entertainment is pretty much able to legally control the image of any popular fan interpretations of their IP, under the guise of supporting small developers, which allows them to further keep the truth buried. I mean, I guess when I put it like that, it sounds like I'm accusing Scott's real-world Fanverse initiative of being malicious, which it's definitely not. It's super cool of Scott to help fund spin-offs of his franchise. But the point still stands that it creates an interesting new way to look at Fazbear Entertainment as a corporate entity. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time trying to convince you of my theory, but what does this actually mean for the canon story? Well, first of all, if I'm right, then we can condense the FNAF universe back into a single timeline. Not a bunch of alternate universes or parallel dimensions, but a single world where all of the original games, fan games, and books exist as pieces of fiction inspired by rumors and real events. Secondly, we can start making assumptions about the game universe by recontextualizing the events of the books as secondhand accounts of real events, instead of either categorizing them as true or untrue. For instance, although Into the Pit is almost certainly a work of fiction, it's perhaps inspired by the real memories and experiences of a writer who is familiar with the Fazbear brand. Perhaps the town where the games take place actually was a bustling town lively in the 80s, but did fall into disarray when the mill closed down, like it does in Into the Pit. And then the local economy was only revitalized when a new Freddy Fazbear location opened back up later on. I'm not saying that that specifically is true, I'm just saying it's a conclusion that can be drawn when you stop asking, does this fit into what I already know, and instead start asking, why would someone write this? Thirdly, we can begin to refit confusing parts of the old story to better align with what makes sense in the new story. I know that that's probably the most controversial take in this whole video, but Scott himself admits that he was writing the story as he went along, and the original games didn't do a great job of conveying that story clearly.
I definitely left a lot of things open-ended in case I wanted to expand upon them later. I mean, obviously, I did not have the entire story planned out, as I know there's much debate about that on the subreddit. Like, oh, he's some kind of mad genius that had, 7 games planned out from the beginning. No, I didn't. But I definitely knew that the story I was telling in the first game was a small snippet of a larger story, even if I didn't have all the details of that story fleshed out yet.
If Scott finally has the details fleshed out now, then it's fair to say that many of those early open-ended plot threads likely aren't a good fit anymore, and newer information on the lore will be more valuable than older information. So while we wait for the secret of the Mimic to hopefully answer some of those big questions, or just create even bigger questions, I think there'd be some value in taking a second look at a lot of the post-Help Wanted content from this new lens, both reevaluating the books as just books, and replaying the games without the preconceived notions of what the original story might have been. This theory was a lot less about confirming a specific idea by using a bunch of specific evidence, and was more about proposing a broad thesis that could help recontextualize all of the evidence from the books in a way that was more consistent with the lore in the games. That being said, I do have a few specific examples from the books I'd like to quickly cover at the end of the video here. First of all, I know some people think that the Stitch Wraith and the Mimic Stingers are the only canon parts of the books, but personally, I'm not super convinced. Even though the Mimic exists in the game universe and has a vague similarity to the Mimic in the books, this could easily be the result of a writer hearing a rumor about an evil mimicking robot that wore costumes ages ago. That could also help explain why the name Edwin comes out of nowhere for a character that people think is incredibly similar to Henry. The writer just made up the name for the story. Although the story GGY is assumed to be about Gregory from the games, I think it might just be a story inspired by the fact that in-universe, GGY is at the top of almost every arcade machine in the Pizzaplex. If you were a Fazbear writer and caught wind of an actual real-world mystery about who GGY was, you'd probably use that as inspiration for a story, and assume that GGY was someone named Greg, which is a pretty easy assumption to make. And finally, I do not think that Dittophobia confirms that FNAF 4 had any sort of hallucinogenic gas. I think it's probably just the result of an in-universe writer being inspired by the theories about FNAF 4 having hallucinogenic gas and then writing a story about it. Overall, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys think of all this in the comments below. I'm sure it'll be a mixed bag of responses, but hey, maybe it'll warrant a second video. Get subscribed if you don't want to miss it. Happy 10-year anniversary, everyone. With all that being said, I will see you in the next one.